So pest and disease with clematis, unfortunately there are not too many pest and disease problems with clematis. If you get white fly or green fly or some of those sort of simple, annoying little pests, whatever you use to control those on your roses, then use the same method, whether you're organic or not, on your clematis. So that looks after that fairly well. And then, Madam, you asked about clematis wilt. Clematis wilt will sometimes affect some of the old large flowered cultivars. I'm not saying it won't affect some of the new ones. It certainly will if the conditions are wrong. And clematis wilt is really caused by a fungal problem which is called Phoma clematidina. And basically this fungal problem could be in your soil. Your clematis, maybe the stem gets twisted by some rough winds or something like that. The rain comes and can splash up the spores into the stem of the clematis, and very basically the spores will develop. They'll block up the sap stream, and the clematis will wilt, literally wilt down. Very often people say to me that they've had problems with clematis wilt in their gardens, and I say, well, tell me what it looks like. And they say, well, the leaves go yellow, then they go brown up the plant. Well, that's purely lack of water, nothing to do with clematis wilt. You'll know if you get clematis wilt, you'll probably go out one evening, and it's usually in sort of May or June when the plants are really growing away quite strongly, and you think, well, I'm going to have a supper party in 2 weeks, that clematis is going to look marvellous. You go out 2 days later and the whole thing's collapsed down, and the leaves don't go brown, they go black. So if that should happen to you, or not to you, but your clematis, then chop the clematis down to almost ground level, burn the top growth, get rid of any old leaves that are about, and then spray the tiny bit of clematis that's left and the surrounding ground area to a diameter of 45 centimeters. Spray that with a copper-based fungicide. That's the only thing that we've really got left that will kill or deal with the fungal spores. So for instance, if your plant has done that, you sprayed it, and then if you planted it that extra little bit deeper that I've advised, then most certainly your plant will grow from below soil level again. As soon as it gets up to about 15 centimeters, just take out the growing tip, because you want the plant to become bushy from its base, and then continue at monthly intervals to use the copper-based fungicide. If, for instance, you've had problems in your garden last year with clematis wilt, where the plants have collapsed down, well, now is the time to start. Buy a copper-based fungicide, drench the plant really from about 45 centimeters downwards, wet all the leaves, wet all of the surrounding soil area to a diameter of about 45 centimeters, and continue to do that at monthly intervals, and hopefully you'll overcome the problem. So hopefully that will answer your clematis wilt problem. I think it probably is. Yeah. The question was about, is Artiquine more resistant to clematis wilt than Duchess of Edinburgh? The Duchess has been around for a very long time, and sometimes the plants are a little bit weak. So I would like to say, and I would like to think, that my Artiquine is better, but I can't guarantee that. Okay, and then feeding clematis, you can use tomato feed or rose feed. That works really very well indeed. And then I think the last thing to really share with you is the pruning of clematis. And people, quite understandably, can get quite confused about what to do and when to prune their clematis. And I know at home in our old property, we've rebuilt a Victorian lean-to glass house, and I'm growing peaches and apricots and gages and grapevines and things like that. My father was a great expert on those. I was more interested in playing hockey or probably chasing girls when I was very young, so I wasn't interested in learning about those things. So very often when my days are pretty long because of our business, so I go home, have supper, have a couple of glasses of wine, get out my reference books about peaches and grapes and all the rest of it. Next morning you wake up and think, well, what did I really read? I don't understand. So that taught me to think, well, gosh, how complicated pruning clematis might be for people. So firstly, rule number one is whatever clematis you buy this summer, this spring, this summer, when you get to next spring, then whatever species or cultivar it is, you prune it back to about 15 centimeters, 30 centimeters of soil level. Then that will encourage the plant to become really bushy and strong from its base. If you don't do that and you've got a montana that's grown to 3 or 4 meters and you think, oh, I'm not going to prune that back, you'll be really cross with yourself after a couple of years or so, because your montana is going to be bare all to its base to this sort of height. So be tough, prune it back hard, and then it'll become really bushy. So that's the first spring after you planted your new clematis. Then we look at the early flowering ones, the evergreens like Armandi, the Alpina, the Macropetalus, and the montanas like this. As you can see, they're all growing, flowering I should say, on short stalks that are about 10 centimeters or maybe a little bit less, and all those flowers are coming from the ripened previous season's growth. So that applies to the evergreens, the Alpinas, the Macropetalus, and the montanas. With those, no pruning until they finish flowering. And when they finish flowering, most of them will put on new growth, as this plant is doing. So it's a matter of really trimming them back and keeping them within their allotted space. If you've got a montana that's 8 or perhaps 10 meters up into a tree, Mother Nature will take care of its pruning. Nothing is really required. So that's pruning group 1. Pruning group 2 are the lovely old varieties, some of the doubles and the semi-doubles of the older ones, Melimosa, the President, Lazarstone, those ones, which are the early large-flowered cultivars. With those, pruning to be done end of winter, very early spring, before they come into growth, and you take out the dead and weak growth, and maybe take about a third of the growth away. Then we come to the later flowering ones, the summer flowering ones like Jackmani, which I'm sure you all know, the Viticella types, and the later flowering species and their cultivars. Quite simply with those, end of winter, early spring, before new growth starts, you prune them back to about 30, 45 centimeters, depending on how old the plant actually is. Because those ones will put on new growth and produce their flowers on what we call the current season's growth. So if you don't know what your clematis is called, so you can't refer to the reference books, but you know when it flowers, I have a very silly saying that if your clematis flowers before June, don't prune. So use that as just as a loose guideline, because it means that if it flowers from June onwards, then it's producing its flower on the new wood, so it needs a hard pruning. And then, as I've mentioned, with Rebecca, Ice Blue, Kingfisher, the Boulevard series of Angelique, Fleury, and those ones, you can do a ponytail cut with those at the end of winter, early spring, and it explains that on the label.